Hello class, Professor Jim Albrecht here, and we're starting off our course with John Locke's Treatise of Civil Government. It may seem a little strange that we're starting a literature class with a work of political philosophy, but actually literary scholars read all sorts of texts, not just poems and novels and plays, but religious texts and political texts, because we need to understand the historical context in which literature was written. And for our class, which is about American ideas of liberty and individual fulfillment, there's probably no more important text to begin with than Locke's Treatise of Civil Government, because it's really the founding text of the liberalism, the school of liberalism that has shaped America's political and economic institutions from Locke's time in the 17th century up until the present. We'll be working today on skills of literary study. We want to work on reading complex texts actively, recognizing key passages, and raising questions about them. And so I've picked a couple of key passages, in my view, from Locke's of Civil Government, and I'll be trying to go over with you the phrases and the key concepts that I see in those passages, and then raising interpretive questions about the ideas in those passages. And our goal here is also to understand a text in its historical moment, in its historical context, and react to it from our context as well. So the questions I ask you to think about in relation to Locke are, first of all, why does he base his view of society and the individual and liberty on this idea of a state of nature? What is the rhetorical or persuasive force of appealing to nature, quote unquote, in this fashion? And then, well, what is Locke's state of nature like? What are the traits of nature that Locke emphasizes? And what about human nature? What is human nature like in Locke's view? What key human traits does he emphasize? And then most importantly, what are the consequences that follow from the assumptions that Locke makes? In other words, if one defines nature in the fashion that he does, how does that shape one's view of society and liberty? So again, I've picked for what I think is a key passage, a key section in this text, the section called Of Property. I'm going to read through it with you, and I want you to listen, I want you to pay attention to the argument, and look for what you think are key phrases or key ideas. God, who hath given the world to men in common, hath also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. The earth and all that is therein is given to men for the support and comfort of their being. And though all the fruits it naturally produces, and beasts it feeds, belong to mankind in common, as they are produced by the spontaneous hand of nature, and nobody has originally a private dominion exclusive of the rest of mankind in any of them, as they are thus in their natural state. Yet, being given for the use of men, there must be of necessity a means to appropriate them some way or other, before they can be of any use, or at all beneficial to any particular man. The fruit or venison which nourishes the wild Indian, who knows no enclosure, and is still a tenant in common, must be his, and so his that is a part of him, that another can no longer have any right to it before it can do him any good for the support of his life. Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature hath placed it in, it hath by this labor something annexed to it, that excludes the common right of other men. For this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough, and as good, left in common for others. God gave the world to men in common, but since he gave it to them for their benefit, and the greatest conveniencies of life they were capable to draw from it, it cannot be supposed he meant it should always remain common and uncultivated. He gave it to the use of the industrious and rational, and labor was his title to it, not the fancy or covetousness of the quarrelsome and contentious. Okay, well, here's what jumps out at me as a reader. First of all, I find it very interesting that in a state of nature, there exists individual private property. I find that an interesting concept. So let's look at Locke's argument as to why he says this is so. He starts by saying, God gave the earth to all men in common, and he gave them reason to use it. And he says, although nothing belongs to anybody individually at first, everybody has a common access to property, there must be, he says, of necessity, some way to appropriate the goods of nature. And he gives an example, quite an interesting example, I think, of an Indian, a Native American. Remember, Locke is writing in 1690 about, so there are already English colonies in Massachusetts and Virginia and Maryland, other places. And he says even that Indian who kills a deer and eats it, by eating that meat, makes it his property, right? He takes it into his own body. Now, Locke bases property beyond that on labor. And notice how he starts with the individual. Every man has a property in his own person, his own body. And then through labor, he puts his labor into something in the state of nature. What? Maybe an apple tree. Maybe he finds an apple tree and picks apples. Now he has removed those apples, Locke says, from the state of nature, and they are now his property, and they belong to him, even in the state of nature. Interesting, right? But look at the interesting qualification that we get a little further down. At least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. Well, where is enough nature? Where is there enough land in the state of nature for everybody to go and put their own labor into? Maybe not in England so much, but maybe in America. So we may already see in Locke the idea of the new world, of the colonies, affecting his kind of political argument here. And then, for me, perhaps the most important phrase in this key passage is here at the end. That it cannot be supposed that God meant that nature should remain common and uncultivated. He gave it to the use of the industrious and the rational. Now keep that phrase in mind because it seems very important to me. So, having looked at some of these key passages and thought about what they might mean, now let's raise some questions about them. And remember, here's the kind of main question I was asking you from the reading questions in our lesson. If one defines nature in the way that Locke does, how does that shape your view of society and liberty? So for instance, if property exists in the state of nature, how important will property be in a Lockean or a liberal view of the purpose of society and of individual liberty? So you can look for that in Locke and in other writers as we go ahead. How important is property in liberalism and our ideas of individualism in America? Now, in terms of historical context, and you'll learn more about this when we read John Dewey about Locke, Locke was writing to assert the rights of an emerging commercial middle class against the feudal system of economic and political privileges crowned by the divine right of kings argument. Well, how might that purpose of Locke's explain why he wants to assert that there is a natural basis of individual private property, that there is private property in the state of nature, right? And this key phrase, the industrious and the rational. Well, who are the industrious and the rational? Who would Locke have identified with this label? When Locke is looking at England, his immediate context, who does he think are the industrious and the rational people? Who would he exclude from that? And if you are among the industrious and the irrational, what are you entitled or justified to do in this scheme of Locke's? So let's keep those questions in mind, and as we look ahead to other writers that we're going to be reading in the coming classes, think about what happens to these Lockean ideas when they are transferred into an American context. For instance, who would be the industrious and the rational to Jefferson, to Thomas Jefferson, or to Benjamin Franklin? And who would not be included in this group? And how would such distinctions matter? How would they shape the political or the economic rights of different persons in America? Those are all questions we can think about as we go forward. So I would like you to, having gone through this one passage and this very important idea of property in Locke's argument, I would like you to now, in your own reading and thinking and writing about Locke, pursue some similar questions. Look at other aspects of Locke's argument, other aspects of the way he discusses the state of nature and the state of civil society that emerges from it. So here are some questions. Again, these are just repetitions from the reading questions I'd like you to think about. What is the individual's relation to society in Locke's formulation? We've seen the individual in the state of nature, where Locke says the individual has private property. Well, what else does the individual have in the state of nature for Locke? And why does the individual want to go into society? What is the purpose of society? And what is human nature like in Locke's view? What key human traits does he emphasize? You can look at the passage we just read together, think about the traits there, but other places in the selections that I've given you from the second treatise, what traits of human nature is Locke emphasizing? And lastly, again, what consequences follow if you define the state of nature in this fashion? And particularly, what's the idea of liberty or freedom for Locke? What does it seem to mean to the individual in Locke's state of nature who goes into the state of civil society? What kind of liberty or freedom is that individual looking for, and how does an individual achieve liberty in Locke's vision? So those are some things to think about as we move ahead. And these are ideas that I hope that you will be sharing with each other in our discussions and in your writing that you're doing for your reading journal. And I can't wait to see what you all have to say about these important ideas. Thanks.